So this is a great way to start a video with so. So welcome. How's that? This is going to be on page 72, number 5. This is the football program. And of course we have Archie. I don't know if Archie is the manager. I don't know if Archie is a fan. I don't even know who Archie is. The only Archie I know is Archie Manning and the Archie that was in Archie comic books. Oh, and Archie Bunker. Can't leave him out.
Yeah, I like Archie.
So what we need to do is we need to calculate the final score based on how many touchdowns. And that's how they do it in football. You know, how many touchdowns did you get? You had 6 points. How many extra points? You got 1 point. How many 2-point conversions? 2 point. And how many safeties? And as far as I know, that's the only way that you can score, unless there's a way that the scorekeeper can add some points on without anybody noticing it, but that's highly unlikely. So I've already created the CPP file, which we've named football, and we put up top the chapter and page 72, number 5, the name of the program, and also very important is your name. And I know that eventually I'll learn how to hit a capital letter. So then you would have underneath it this program is going to do and fill in your information for that. So now we need to determine what kind of variables we have. So I'm hitting a space between main and here just to make it look a little bit easier to read. You don't want to do a ton of spaces. So first thing we need to know is how many touchdowns that we need. So a good name for a touchdown would be number of touchdowns. Now you can do it like this, or you could make this capital D. I think touchdown is normally one word. And since it's an integer, we're going to initialize it to 0. I'm not putting a comma, I'm putting a semicolon so I can create it on the next line. Now, I did one thing wrong. I should have hit the enter key here, and that'll make it line up much easier. So now we're going to do number of extra points.
So if you didn't do this method, you have to do it line by line?
Yes.
Like,
I mean, the only thing it really does is save you typing integer.
Oh.
But it also allows you to group items easier. And to me, it makes more sense to have all your integers grouped together, all your floats grouped together, all your strings grouped together, and all of your characters grouped together. But again, that's also a judgment call. There's no one way that fits all. So now we're going to do number of 1 point. Actually, should be 2-point conversions.
What is the purpose of the equals 0?
Because you're initializing it. If you don't initialize things, Microsoft Visual Studio will give you an error message if you try to use it when it's not initialized. But other programs, such as Eclipse or one of the others, might not. And what will happen is you might say, say touchdown points equals number of touchdowns times 6. Well, if you don't initialize it, it could be what basically a area memory. So when you create a variable, what it does is say, okay, this is an integer. I want to name it number of touchdowns, and the number of touchdowns is a reference point to an area in memory. Now, whatever happens to be in memory, that's what number of touchdowns is going to point to. If you put in a 0, you're guaranteed that it's going to be a 0 in there. But if you're not
like default, then.
Yeah, you could call it a default, but it's basically saying number of touchdowns starts with 0. Number of extra points starts with 0. If you don't put it there, it could start with anything. And you can't take that into the... Remember, your program not only has to work and compile in Visual Studio, it has to be able to work in every single platform, period. So, all right, so number 2, point conversions. And, you know, you don't have to type in every word. And everything's going to be 0. Then we're going to do number of safeties.
When it comes to naming variables, is this, I think this is called camel casing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Camel casing is where all of the letters are lowercase except for every other word, not counting the first word, is capitalized. In other words, if you just have one word, such as last name, you can do last name all lowercase. But if you decide to make it last name as 2 separate words, you do last and then capital N. So that's called camel case in there. And I'm very strict on that. So make sure that everything is camel case. So now what we need to do is, and at this point in time, I'm not commenting only for time purposes, but you would put a comment in here. And I'm just hitting the tab key, say twice, put number of touchdowns scored in the game. And then, you know, sometimes is, you know, you don't really need to comment the same thing each and every time if the first one is going to basically be a self-explanatory for the other ones. Now, it doesn't mean it's bad to do it, but, you know, a lot of it
before or after, or is it better to put it next to the variable? Or
I normally do it before because it gets to the point where I don't do it after.
Okay, I see.
So I get lazy and I just want to get it done. You know how that works.
Yeah, right. I just want to get this stuff done. Like,
perfect.
I want to learn it right.
So now what we need is determine the points that each one does. Because the one thing we don't want to do, let me bring this thing up here. Let me get your code here. See how you have field goal times 3. Well, what happens if for some reason in the middle of the game or the end, you have all these programs and they decide to make extra points 2 points? You know, that's kind of far-fetched, but then your calculation here for extra points would be wrong. So I'm going to show you how to fix that.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that too.
So that's where you never want to use a literal when you can use a constant. For anything that cannot change, you should use a constant. Another reason for it is, let's say you're calculating the points in 3 different areas. Well, then you have to do 6, 6, 6. Whereas if you did it using a constant, you can use that same one over and over again. And if it does change, then all you have to do is change the constant name. So you'll see that more as we go along. So let's do our
constant is so it can change, right? Like
a constant cannot change. An example of it would be pi, 3.14, and I can go on like 15 things.
Oh yeah,
but when you're calculating the area of a circle, or the diameter in there, you know, one is pi r squared and one is pi d. So for that, you're going to be using pi all the time in there.
Oh, for number 6, that's what you got. Okay, you got to use a constant for that. Okay.
So yeah, that's exactly right. So that works out really good. So now what we need is the sum, and I'm going to put total score, assuming I spelled it right, and we'll start that off with 0. So we have that. Now this is where writing down all the variables that you're going to need first before you start programming. So now we're done. So now we're going to do a constant integer. And this is where we're going to use capital letters. So I'm going to put points per touchdown equals 6. And it should be.
So I think there's
Okay.
integers, there's constants, and
Well,
then is there another one? Like
the only thing that constant means, it can't change. There's constant integer, there's constant, any kind of variable can be declared a constant. That means it cannot change. Well, the number of points per for TD is not going to ever change during the game. If it does, boom. So then we'll have points per, and you don't have to put per, but, you know, again, it doesn't cost much except a little bit of extra typing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it makes more sense. But yeah, I see.
It's more readable, you can say.
Yeah, I think now
So we get 1 point for now.
Okay, this make it more easy.
I think you put a hyphen there.
Yeah, that's what. Oh, I did. You're right.
Yeah, I remember that. All constants got to be in full capital letter, right?
Well, the compiler doesn't care, but when you see it in your code, it's a standout that it's a capital letter. See, I can put it in anything that I want. The compiler could care less, but it's just good. Let me give you an example. Let me just put these things in here first. So we have 1 point and points per.
I'm gonna copy your code completely, but then I want to go back and redo it and do it my way. Like instead of
Well,
copying
don't copy it. I'll email it to you. I mean, you can if you want. It's totally up to
I just
you.
want to follow along so I can get the hands-on.
That's fine.
When you're doing it.
Yeah, I'm
So
gonna
now
take
we're
a screenshot so I can.
All right. So here we are. Now I could have typed in P6, P1, P2, anything that I wanted to in there, and the compiler could care less. But doesn't points per TD make more sense? Is a little bit more descriptive. So I'm going to just comment this one here. Whoops, that was not too bright.
I'm getting like a squiggly line when I copied your top. There's a squiggly line underneath it.
It might be because you're missing something. Is it a red squiggly line or?
It's like a red squig. I put the T.
That means there's a issue with it. So we'll look at that when I get done with this here, and it's not a big deal. All right. So we have points per TD. I just put. And yeah, it's kind of a pain in the neck typing this stuff, but here's the reason why. You are working on this program, and everything goes fine, you publish it, la-di-da-di-da-di-do. 6 months later, your boss says, look, I need you to make changes on this code. When you have these things commented, you know exactly what you're thinking at the time. Or if you're working on somebody else's code and say they just had NT. You know, well, what does NT mean? NE or NumT, NumE, you know. So when you comment, you know exactly what these things are, because believe me, you will forget what your code is doing at the time. So trust me, it's a lot easier to do all this stuff. So we have the total score in here and points in here. So that looks good for right now. So we're missing 2 things. Now, if you try to compile the main program without the return 0 or without the system pause, you will not get an error message in Visual Studio, but you will get a 5-point deduction. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let me comment this out. However, others will be. But so the rule is every function, you know it's a function because it begins with a variable name, type rather. Every function must return a value. And you can return anything you want based upon what you want it to be. It could be return 0, meaning it did fine, return 1. That's up to the calling program. So we don't really need to worry about that. So let's go and choose build and see what happens. And we'll just compile it.
Professor, what's the point of what's compiler do? Is that
What
just like
the
tells you
compiler
it's
does, it takes the code that you wrote and converts it halfway into what's called object code, meaning it checks for errors and then it converts it in a format that can be converted into what's called executable code, which is binary. So it's a two-step process. You have to compile it first, and then you have to convert it to an exe. So right now we don't have any code that we can execute. I mean, that's standard for all languages with the exception of those that are interpreted. Then you just run it. What that means is if you have a version of BASIC that is not interpreted, that is interpreted, you run the code, and while it's running, it actually interprets it. So it's going to run much slower because it's having to compile and convert everything as you're running it. So you could get halfway through the program and then get an error in here. So you always want to compile your stuff first to make sure. Now, C++, you do not have a choice. You have to do that. So here we have everything just peachy keen. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put a prompt. How many touchdowns? And I'm putting a question mark and a space. That's cosmetic, just to make it easier to read. Then I'm going to do cin and num. Now notice as I type in num, I have my num touchdown somewhere.
So the cin was talking to the variable that you created.
Yeah, well, cout stands for console out. So just think of it as a print. Cout is print on the screen.
Print on screen. Okay.
And cin really means get input from the keyboard,
okay.
or however you're doing it.
Oh,
so now we're getting the number of touchdowns. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to calculate our sum, our total score, equals, parentheses,
okay, this is what I was
num touchdowns. And this is where what's good is now you can do points per touchdown. And then we'll print it out. And I'm a big fan of doing one thing and then testing it, then doing something else and then testing it. So if you make a mistake in this, you're going to know. One of the hardest things to do is find when you get a data error, logic error, meaning you coded something and you're doing something incorrect. And if you're doing a whole bunch of stuff, it's almost impossible to determine what went wrong in here. That's why you have to actually go into debug. So I put total points is, and then we'll do total score.
Okay, that makes more sense.
And we'll do a end out.
See, that's where I'm like right now. I'm getting the error with this. Even though I type perfectly what you wrote, I'm getting like the error.
Well, you must be missing something, maybe a curly brace or something to that effect. So as soon as I get done, I will look at it and see. I'm
Okay.
glad that that's happening, because now you're going to be able to see what's happening. But if you hold your mouse over the red squiggly line, it should tell you what the problem is.
I mean, I do have what it wants, but it's still giving me a squiggly line.
Well, what is it telling you?
It says expected a semicolon.
Okay,
But
that probably means you missed a semicolon somewhere. So,
I mean,
yeah, that's
it would
okay.
be-
Those
yeah.
are usually fairly easy to fix. So as soon as I get done with this program,
Sure.
then we'll check it out. So
Okay.
now I'm going to run it and see what happens. We want to start without debugging. So if I have an error in logic, I'm going to find out right now. So how many touchdowns? So that's 2. So we know that our total points should be 12. And total points, I must have missed is. It's 12. All right. So we know that part is right. Total points. Oh, duh. So now we're going to do the next thing. We're going to get how many.
Yeah,
You
this
know
is
what? I also noticed too when you shared your videos that the font is really small. So when I try to look at it, I'm trying to see if it's either a equal sign or an underscore or a dash.
Well,
I'm like,
I can make my fonts bigger when I'm doing it, and I'll show you how to do that.
okay, yeah.
In a
I'm
second.
looking at it, I can't see because I'm blind.
Well, but if you hit Control Plus, that'll make it bigger.
Control plus.
Assuming you're on a Windows machine.
Okay, yeah.
So I will show you, assuming they haven't changed it. But there's you can make the screen size bigger. So down here on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Come on, Mr. Mouse.
Yeah, that's much
better?
better. Much better.
All right, so we'll make it.
yeah, that's a word.
All right, let's do 150. That might be.
Yeah, 150 is perfect.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
perfect right there.
All right, so see, I have a total score here, and it says expected semicolon. Well, I haven't finished this right here, and that's what that's for. So how many, what are we doing? Next is extra
Extra
points.
points.
Okay.
Extra points. Yeah, this is. I want to know if you have to rewrite the total score and then for the thing again.
All right, so, and I'm going to skip a space in here. So we're going to do CN, and we're going to get num extra points. And it'll compile it. So now we'll do different data, and we'll see what happens. So Control F5.
But then you have to, let me see.
All right, so let's do 2 touchdowns, and we'll do 2 extra points. And that's 12. So we have logic error. Notice I left something out on purpose.
Yeah, that's what I was
But
gonna
right
say.
off the bat, by testing this there, we know we missed something. Any of you guys want to take a crack at what it could be?
You forgot to do the num extra
The total
points.
score. Right?
There you go.
Like the
Exactly.
Calculation.
That's exactly what it is. So, what we're going to do, there's separate ways of doing it. So let's put num score, and let's put it in here. Score equals. By the way, I know I mentioned it in class, but there's never just one way to do something. So I will show you alternative ways of calculating things. And each has its pluses and minuses. So now we have num touchdowns, points per deep, plus num extra points.
Did you need the other parentheses at the beginning? For being-
Yes, and I'll explain why.
Okay.
Okay, the reason why is this is a calculation. So any calculations must be in parentheses. And then this is you have a calculation inside a calculation. Notice this is the plus here. So if you didn't have this parentheses here, you'd have a calculation not inside of it, and it would cost you 5 points on your grade. Now, this is my style of doing things. And my thinking behind it is when you go the extra mile, you definitely are going to solve issues that will come up much easier than if you didn't do it. The worst thing you can ever have is a program that gives you the wrong errors. Gives you the wrong thing. So we have 25 minutes here. I'm going to stop it right now.